Good morning, Rock the Closing listeners. Today we are talking about due diligence for houses. You may recall if you were listening in, we already discussed the due diligence for condos and co-ops, and today we're just going to talk a little bit about the due diligence required when you're purchasing a home. So let's get right into it. Orsolya, what are the various aspects of due diligence when purchasing a home?
So the first step would be the buyer's impression. Obviously, most likely that's one of the most important steps. And the buyer goes into a number of open houses and picks the one that talks to him, picks the one house that he feels like this can be my future home. So that we call the buyer's impression, which means that the buyer goes in, looks around, looks underneath the carpet, looks from basement to the top, up to the roof, and decides, yes, this is the house that I really would like to purchase. So buyer's inspection would be the first step. Secondly, the buyer usually brings in an inspector. In some cases, it's recommended that the buyer also hires an architect or a structural engineer to visit the house. Then a survey can be ordered prior to signing any contract. Some attorneys will also undertake a house history review. We will talk about that later. Then public websites, tax websites, any open violation and permits will be assessed also through public website of Department of Buildings. And then there is the review of the certificate of occupancy. Let's go into some details, Dalia. What is the inspection process?
Great question. An inspection is really important for a buyer. So once a buyer do their own due diligence of going and looking at the house and they decide, yep, this is the house I like, this is the house I want. Next step is to hire an inspector. This is at the expense of the buyer. They hire an inspector, a professional one, and that person will come look at the house. This is a pretty comprehensive look at the home. The inspector will issue a written report, and this will be a detailed condition of every part of the house, from the garage to the roof to the basement. This inspector is looking at walls. They're checking the electrical system. They're checking all the plumbing, the appliances. Do they work? What is the condition of the floors? Do the windows open and shut? Are they broken? What is broken? Are there tiles that need to be replaced in the kitchen? All that kind of stuff. And most importantly, actually, they are also checking for things like hidden damage, right? So maybe there was a fire in the home or a flood in the home and there's some wood rot behind your sheetrock or something like that. And a seller has covered it up with paint, right? And you as a buyer or an agent walking through the house would never suspect because there's no smell, there's no indication, but an inspector would pick up on that. You know, that's definitely something you want to know, and it might be something that you want to consider when you're putting in your offer. Another thing that they would let you know is if there's an oil tank buried on the property. So that's something definitely to know. And so they'll issue you the report. This report will have pictures. It'll be very detailed, maybe 30 pages long. You'll definitely want to give that to your buyer's attorney, and you want to look at it yourself, mark it up, and take a look at what you find concerning. Because sometimes the things that you find concerning an inspection report are kind of minor. They may be kind of major, but you definitely want to put in your 2 cents when you're giving it to your attorney, okay? Because a lot of times the inspector doesn't necessarily give an indication of whether you should reject the home completely because of this condition, right? So that's something that you might want to talk to your attorney about, your family about, things to consider. Okay, so that's really important. Orsolya, you mentioned earlier that architects and structural engineers are part of the due diligence process. When do they come into play?
I would say it's optional, but I like to be very thorough and put this out on the table and advise my clients that, look, you are purchasing a standalone house. It's really important that you make sure that the foundation is solid, the walls are solid, that this house is not going to collapse on you in the next coming of couple of years. Obviously, I'm risk averse. And sometimes structural issues cannot be detected through a simple inspection. which is more looking at open defects rather than structural latent defects. And that's why I am suggesting the buyer to bring in an architect and a structural engineer. However, again, this is optional because obviously these are professionals who would be charging the client considerable money. So it will be the buyer's cost. And if the buyer afterwards decide not to go forward with the purchase because the architect or the structural engineer discovers, a wall, a load-bearing wall falling over in a couple of years, then he might decide that, I don't want to buy a collapsing house, which is a good reason to not to buy the house. However, it will also require some upfront investment, but at least the buyer will walk away with less damage paying upfront for an architect and a structural engineer than later on discovering such a significant latent defect. And then he will be sitting on a house that is, so to say, requires significant constructions. So again, optional, but it's a good upfront investment to make sure that what you are buying is rock solid. Dalia, let's talk a little bit about the fences and map. What is a survey and why is it important to have one?
So like you said, we really need to look at this whole property when you're buying a house. Anybody who owns a freestanding home with some property and some grass knows that it's a lot to take care of. Just maintaining it is a big deal. So you definitely want to make sure that on day one of your ownership, everything is in order. The inspection is great. Structural engineer has okayed it. And in addition, you want to make sure you have a good survey. So what's a survey? A survey is basically a map of the property. It sort of looks like a big blueprint, right? Like to you, it might look like an aerial view drawing of the property where the house is. There's lots of lines and measurements, right? Where does the house fall? How many feet from the property line is your house? Is your driveway? How long is the driveway? That kind of thing. Right. So it's very specific measurements to delineate what is on your property, where on your property is it, and whose property is where. Because as you know, a house abuts another house, right? Your property lines are very specific. They are right here at this rock, right? Or this bush. And people who own houses want to make sure you're paying a lot for your house. You want every part of that property that's yours to be for your use. Right? Maybe you want to plant flowers there, whatever you want on the sides of the house. So you definitely need to know where those lines are, where your property starts, where it ends, where your neighbor's starts and ends. Many times there's a border fence that might be too far over when we're purchasing a home. Now, you might think, well, that's not nice. Somebody put their fence on someone else's property 5 feet in or 3 feet in to someone else's property. But it's important because the survey will let you know if that fence needs to be moved. A few inches is not usually a problem because over time, over years, the ground moves, the dirt moves, your fence will move. So that's okay. But several feet over is not okay. I don't know, maybe you've had a bunch of earthquakes and this fence has moved significantly. It's got to be moved back when you purchase a property and you need to actually own what's yours. Okay, so I personally think a survey is a great thing to have and it's a great thing to know. Orsolya, you mentioned history of ownership. What are we talking about there?
Okay, so I really enjoy looking into property's ownership. First of all, one important aspect is to find out when the house was built, because that's already going to tell you a lot about the structure. Then secondly, I like to review who is or who were the owners and give a very little overview to my clients, to the buyers. In New York City, we have the so-called Automated City Register Information System. Everybody is referring to it like ACRIS. It's an open source, it's an open website, and you can just put in the property address and then you will see the history of ownership, the history of mortgages, and very often, especially with New York houses, you can find out who was the first owner, then who maybe inherited it, who purchased it, what year, for how much it was purchased, and then whether there was a mortgage taken out, satisfied, and then how it evolved until the point where your future buyer is coming in and is going to be registered. So Acris, it's an open source and it tells you about previous owners, previous mortgages, and it's just interesting for the buyer, but I do like to look it up. One important aspect of it is to see that who is the current seller and to verify that the current seller is on the deed. So you look at the most recent deed and you just make sure that the seller's attorney you are in contact is really representing the owner who is also on the deed. So there is no misunderstanding. I've spoken about New York City, but Dalia, how is it done outside of New York City? What happens in Long Island? How are you dealing with ownership history or deed verification or seller verification?
A good question. A lot of times when people have owned a home for a very long time, it's not uncommon that they forget who's on the deed, right? It might be a home owned by a husband and wife. At some point, for whatever reason, they took one of them off or they added child on the deed and nobody really recalls. And when it's time to put in the deal sheet and draft the contract, they might let their seller's agent know that, oh, it's me and my husband on the deed. But then what happens when that's not the case? So what we can do in Long Island is we have a public records website and you can just go on there and check who's on the last recorded deed in the county. So we can find out there. And if there's any discrepancy, I personally found it's not a big deal to just put in an amendment. If the contract gets signed, an incorrect seller's name, spelling, someone is on there that shouldn't be on there or whatever, we'll just amend it. And that's usually not a big deal either. So that's how we do it there. Orsolya, you spoke a little bit about building status. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Right. So again, an attorney usually will also review the building itself and whether there is any violation or whether there is anything popping up. So for example, the Department of Building Information System or the Department of Housing of Preservation and Development will have information if there is any job filings, if there is any open permits, if there are any violations imposed on the house, on the property, if there has been any litigation started against the owner for one or another reason. So you just do a little bit of search to find out what is the current status, what is it that the future buyer will have to deal with, or what is it that the future buyer may want the seller to take care of before closing on this transaction. I just want to highlight maybe one issue that I like to look up, which is the certificate of occupancy. That's a very important document because that is putting the house into operation. So that allows that the house as it is built, it's signed off by the city and it permits the house to be operational so people can move in and people can live inside. So that's called a certificate of occupancy. Usually certificate of occupancy tells us what type of house we are looking at. Is it a 1-family home? Is it a 2-family home? Is it a 2 to 4-family home? Or a 6-family home. So it defines the class of the home and it tells you how the house is supposed to be used. The certificate of occupancy is going to highlight each level of the home, how it can be used. Very often what we are looking at is the cellar basement designation, because very often the basement is just designated as an accessory space or a boiler room. And if you talk to your buyer and your buyer is going to passionately talk about, oh, the basement apartment is fantastic, it has a shower, it has a kitchen, then you will pull up the certificate of occupancy and you will point it out to your buyer that, that's not exactly legal according to the certificate of occupancy. So that might raise some concerns. That's, again, one issue we are looking on the certificate of occupancy. Usually the first floor is designated as apartment or second, third floor as a duplex. It depends. Again, the use of the house is based on the certificate of occupancy, and that's the legally permitted use. I also want to mention here the taxes a little bit. We are looking at the finances and property tax bills of the house to see if the current owner has paid the taxes. Is he current on the taxes or is he a little bit or very much delinquent? It can be dealt with, so that's not raising a really big issue. However, there are two things I like to point out to my buyers, which is one is that the taxes might be much lower because some current owners, some sellers might be entitled to certain tax abatements. If they have a veteran status, if they have school-age children, then they will get a discount on the taxes. And the incoming buyer may not have the same abatements, so he might pay the full taxes. So that's one issue. The other issue is if the incoming buyer is planning to do renovation to the building, then the tax authorities might reassess the value of the building, and that could lead to the taxes to be increased in the coming years. So these are two aspects that I like to highlight when it comes to the taxes. I've spoken too much for here and now, but I think that we talked about so many aspects of due diligence when it comes to a house. Dalia, what is going to happen with all this information that is gathered during the due diligence process? What's the next step?
My goodness, it's a lot to look into before you even sign a contract, right? So we definitely want to gather all that information up. The buyer has to be really involved in this process because this is going to be their home and they need to care about all these things. Like you were speaking about the tax bill, that's really important, especially here in Long Island. That's a big question for buyers. What is that tax bill? Is it $6,000 a year or $23,000 a year? That makes a difference, right? So things like that really need to be considered before you sign a contract because you are bound once you sign that contract and you are expected to have done your due diligence and know about all these things. So after we gather up all this information, the buyer will usually speak with their attorney. They'll review the inspections, the report, the surveys, all that kind of stuff. And at that point, usually, a little back and forth, the buyer will go ahead with the purchase 99% of the time. Because if they've gotten to the point where they've done all this, they really want that piece of property. A lot of times the buyer's attorney will be able to help resolve any issues that come up, like we talked about, maybe in the survey or what have you, so that they can go ahead and get that dream home that they want. So after that's been established, the next step is signing the contract. So that will start the process of closing. Orsolya, am I missing anything?
No, I think covered it well. And I agree with you. Whatever comes up during the due diligence process, I would say that most buyers will go ahead. But the most important is they will go ahead with having made an informed decision and they know what they are going to purchase, what they are going to buy, and they will be aware of the risk.
Yep, this is most people's biggest purchase of their entire life. So we definitely don't want to minimize any of these things. We don't want to leave it to somebody else to review. Definitely want to be involved in the process, make sure it's complete. I know some of these things can be costly, but they're important and they are worth it if this is going to be your forever home. So that is it for us discussing due diligence on houses. We thank you so much for tuning in and listening to us. And we will see you next time on Rock the Closing. Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you for tuning in to Rock the Closing. This podcast is hosted by real estate attorneys who offer valuable insights. Please remember that the content is for educational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. Always consult a qualified professional before making any decisions. This podcast is copyrighted by Rock the Closing, and any reproduction, syndication, or rebroadcasting of the content requires written permission.